You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Oh, Lottie. Oh, cantare. Oh, let's fly way up to the clouds, away from the maddening crowds. We can sing in the glow of a star that I know of where lovers enjoy.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, and even a little bit of news and gossip with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today, we're looking at Dean Martin, the King of Cool. And now, here's Arthur.
Well, hello, everybody. Dean Martin, my lord. Yeah, he's the King of Cool, but also Mr. Charisma. Very few stars, even those who have charisma, had as much charisma as Dean Martin. My goodness. He was absolutely great, had an incredible life. Julian had recommended a book to me that I read called Dino, written by Nick Tochis, a great biography of this guy's life. And he had several different lives within that one life. And I'm going to have pass it on Julian, tell you all about his youth. But he became a superstar, simply put. The superstardom started with Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis. And then it went on from there to movies and records and TV concerts and roasts, and God knows there's so much to talk about. But a really fascinating beginning where it all began, and I want Julian to tell you all about that. Julian, please.
Thanks, Arthur. Born in Steubenville, Ohio, both parents were Italian immigrants. His father was a barber. He actually did a little barbering himself with his dad. They did not speak English in the household for his first 5 years. And so when he went to public school, he was bullied because of his broken English. He didn't really speak English. He was broken English. He was bullied a lot, and he was unhappy in school. And in the 10th grade, he leaves and becomes a welterweight boxer. He's boxing. He gets his nose broken. He has his knuckles cracked, and it turns out that he couldn't afford, supposedly, the knuckles that you need to put the boxing gloves on. So he boxes under the name of Kid Crochet because his real name at that point is Dino Crocetti. And he then, at 17, after doing these crazy jobs, he's a steel worker, he's a bootlegger, he's a card dealer. He does a lot of these kind of menial jobs, and then starts singing at 17 in nightclubs in Ohio. And a guy named Sammy Watkins, who had a big orchestra at that time, said, look, you've now changed your name from Dino Crocetti to Dino Martini. How about Dean Martin? How about that? And he convinces Dean to do that. And that's his beginning, Arthur and Steve and Mike.
Julian, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I have a question because I read in his Wikipedia biography that he started out in the crooning style of singing. Can someone explain to me what that means, crooning style?
What it basically means was he and Perry Como and Frank Sinatra all emulated at the beginning of their career Bing Crosby, who was the ultimate crooner in the music business. And all of them have said when they began, they were emulating the crooner Bing Crosby. And there was another guy that probably only Arthur knows named Russ Columbo. And Russ Columbo also was at that period. But the big one was Crosby, because Crosby was big in movies, television, and radio. He was huge. And they all wanted to be, quote, Bing Crosby.
But what does it actually mean to croon? What does that actually mean?
Crooning is, Steve, here. Crooning is they used to have a nickname for Bing Crosby as the groaner. It's more like, well, when the blue of the night me the gold of the day. That's the original crooning sound, which preceding him, as Julian just mentioned, was a guy named Russ Columbo. He was the first of the crooners. And radio got on, and Russ Columbo, when people would sing, like Al Jolson as an example, they were singing a whole, with a lot of energy and all of it. Crooning was more like that sound. When the blue of the night meet the gold of the day. That began the crooning thing. And Sinatra, as he just said, they all evolved from Bing Crosby, and Bing Crosby became a huge star. He crossed all paths. He was the original recording of White Christmas. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. That's crooning. It's holding a note in a nice melodic sound, and that began the crooning, which evolved into all kinds of things. Because Sinatra, though he crooned at the beginning, got more into a hip jazz, snap your finger kind of thing, and then.
So I assume that only males croon.
Yes.
There's no such
and
thing. Dean
Martin loved Bing Crosby, so he took it right directly from Crosby. And Dean Martin never had the voice in comparison to the rest of these guys, but he had this pleasant, very definitive sound. And it was kind of almost with an accent of some kind of a offbeat Southern accent. But he was singing for years. And so he was around schlepping. He did nightclubs all over the place. Got enough money to get up to New York. He got a $500 nose job because his nose was so big. If you see pictures of him, but before he had the nose job, it doesn't look too much like Dean Martin. Got a great nose job for $500, which he loaned from different people or sold a piece of himself to different people for management. Julian, that's all that stuff in the book.
He constantly sold 10%, even to the Sammy Watkins who started him off. He owned 10%.
Right.
Watkins sued him. He sued him for his 10%.
He sold them 120% of himself in order to get financing through
Max
the years.
Bialy stock. He was the original Max Bialy.
Yeah, that's right.
So did either of you gentlemen ever see him perform live?
Oh, sure. In Vegas, yeah.
Vegas. Yeah. I was probably the only person in Las Vegas who was not a fan of the Rat Pack. I was a fan of Sinatra alone, Sammy Davis alone, Dean Martin alone. They were playing around, and the audience were half drunk, most of them, and they thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. I didn't. I wanted to hear them sing, and I didn't want to hear them. They were not great comics. Actually, Dean Martin was the funniest of them all. Sinatra really wasn't, but he tried to be.
So Dean Martin was very funny, but the Rat Pack became a thing. It was just one of those things that just happened by accident and was become used. I mean, it's something that happened to work. But back to Dean Martin. So Dean Martin became a singer after all these things Julian had mentioned, including dealing blackjack and poker, and he was a boxer. He was all these kind of things. But he always was a good-looking guy, even with the nose. He had this great, good-looking movie star kind of look. And when he got to New York, he was singing these little clubs in New York. And Jerry Lewis, who at the time was maybe 19 years old, idolized him because he was so good-looking, and he wanted to be that, and he could sing. And Jerry Lewis's whole act at that time in the mid-1940s. He did a record act where he would put on a record and mouth the record, and you'd hear the recording voice of, let's say, Caruso or Sinatra, maybe, and he would do the mouthing of it. So anyway, the way it went, is that in 1946, post-war, Jerry Lewis is booked into a nightclub in Atlantic City called the 500 Club, run by a gangster type, a friend of the gangsters named Skinny D'Amato. Very close to Sinatra, who by that time already was a superstar. And Jerry Lewis thing was failing, and he had mentioned to the guy that he could do a great act, and then he mentioned there's this singer. Maybe if I came together with, if you brought him in to sing, and he'd open and I could close, and that's how Dean Martin got in, because Jerry Lewis worshipped him at the beginning. And in he came, and the opening show where Dean Martin sang and then Jerry Lewis came on afterwards, just nobody was there and nobody cared. It just to show it didn't work. It was two people doing their act, but they were not together.
They really bombed.
They bombed, yeah. But it wasn't an act. It wasn't Martin and Lewis. It was Dean Martin, and then it was Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis came up with the idea of doing something different. And the owner of the club said, I'm going to have to get you guys out of here because there's nobody coming and blah, blah, blah. And Jerry Lewis, much to his credit, came up with what was basically a tumult, madness, craziness going on while they were both on stage. So he put together Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. And when Dean Martin came out to start singing, Jerry Lewis was coming out as a waiter, and he dropped the tray and all. It was just crazy stuff that was happening. And the audience loved it. They laughed like crazy, and word got out. And unbelievably, from a nightclub in Atlantic City, these two guys, Martin and Lewis, became superstars in about 2 weeks. Word got out so wide that they were playing the Paramount Theater in New York to 3,000 people about a month and a half later. So it was an instant success. Martin and Lewis, that was just, bigger than anything you could imagine. They were signed to a movie contract. They became big hits in movies. They became superstars. Anybody here understand that? Julian, you know that, you were there. Steve, you may not. You weren't aware of them. You knew their movies.
Yeah, they genuinely liked each other. They were actually good friends
for a period of time.
Yes.
Yeah. Mike, were you growing up? Were you aware of Martin Lewis?
Of course I have.
Okay.
But for me, it was more of their nightclub act, and then later, then I had heard some of the singing and some of the bits through my grandfather mostly, and then of course on reruns, then I started seeing Jerry Lewis movies, and then I saw movies with of course Dean Martin, like Ocean's 11 and stuff like that, and then Matt Helm and later and such. So
yeah, those were the movies. But what happened with them when you catch lightning and something happens that's beyond your control? There's a timing factor, and their timing to become hits was perfect, relating to something called television in its earliest days. And so Milton Berle.
Before you get there, let's talk about the fact that after they play Atlantic City, they go to do Slapsy Maxie. There was a guy, Maxie Rosenblum, and he owned a nightclub. He'd been a boxer, and he had them out there. And in the audience is Hal Wallace. Hal Wallace, one of the biggest producers in Hollywood, had recently left Warner Brothers because he had produced Casablanca. And when it won the Academy Award, Jack Warner ran up and took it. And that was it for Hal Wallace. He had had enough. He had worked on that for 2 years. He'd done everything on it, and Jack Warner just took the Oscar. He quit, went to Paramount, and signed not only Martin and Lewis, but signed Shirley MacLaine and also signed Elvis Presley. So he was really swinging in the 50s. And they start with a movie called My Friend Irma. My Friend Irma with Marie Wilson. And then they do My Friend Irma Goes West. That's their introduction to movies before they do their first movie together. And they had a lot of trouble at the beginning with Wallace. Dean Martin did the screen test. They loved him. But Jerry, they had him do straight stuff. And he kept saying, this is not my character. You've got to let me do my character. And they get a writer named Cy Howard, pretty famous writer, who also directed. And he goes away with Jerry, and they come up with some stuff that Jerry knows how to do with Oranges and My Friend Irma, and it changes everything. And even Hal Wallace admits that they were wrong. He has to do what they've been doing in nightclubs. And then Arthur and Steve and Mike, they get a radio show. They get a radio show for 5 years. They get signed for 5 years. But the radio show is never that big because, as those of us who study these guys know, they're visual. And you can't do visual on radio. So while they do the show and they get to be known nationally because it's NBC, it's when they get signed to Colgate Comedy Hour that everything changes on a national level.
Well, we're back to TV. We're back to TV here now. So the two biggest things that happened in television in the late 40s was Milton Berle, who was basically doing a lot of what Jerry Lewis was doing before Jerry Lewis was even born. And he became a superstar, Milton Berle did. And Martin and Lewis had that window, and they were right in that window with the Colgate Comedy Hour. All of a sudden, they're on TV in everybody's homes, and there were millions of TV sets being sold every day. And they were there right at that great time when it exploded. At the same time, they were humongous in nightclubs, which were at their peak post World War II, late 1940s into the 50s. They were superstars without question, and they were doing everything you could possibly do in entertainment, yes, including of course movies, and they were all hits. They were selling out the Paramount Theater in New York, which I think was 3,000 seats, and doing 8 shows a day at 50 cents a head, and doing I think $1 million a week. So they were money machines for everybody who played them.
Seems to me that post-World War II was a ripe time for comedians. I mean, after the horrors of war, after 5 years of war, nobody wanted to see war pictures anymore. It was a good time for comics. I mean, this is also the same time as Abbott and Costello were on TV and radio as well. It's funny when you were saying that Dean and Jerry had a radio show. This is one pairing where you never had to worry about distinguishing between the two voices. They had very distinct different voices.
Yeah. Well, the fact is that comedy is king, and comedy, if it works, will always succeed. Always, if it works. We had a cousin in our family named Jackie Miles, who was a great comic of the days of during World War II, and he was a nightclub comic. Jackie was a big star of nightclubs all over the United States, and he was being paid $5,000 a week during the war, 1940s, which was like $60,000 a week today. He was making a fortune, but known within that nightclub world. There wasn't TV. He wasn't anywhere near that big a star. But what you're saying is people were going out to nightclubs during the war and after the war, 7 nights a week. It was not Friday, Saturday, and maybe Sunday. It was every night to get happy, to drink, to do whatever they could during the war. So when Martin Lewis came on, they started making crazy numbers. They would get $25,000 a week, $40,000 a week in different clubs around the United States. And every one of our cities, big cities in America, at that time, there were major nightclubs. There was major nightclubs, more than one per city. Slapsy Maxie's in LA was one, of course, as well as Ciro's in the Coconut Grove. So every big city had these huge nightclubs, which were money machines, and they would compete. And so Martin Lewis, because they became so big, were making literally fortunes just out of nightclubs. And then on top of that came television, movies, and all the rest of the thing.
They did
Dean Martin, everybody screamed that they were so funny, but Jerry Lewis even admits that he was really the key to the act. He was the straight man, Dean Martin. He could sing, but he looked so great, and comedy just played off him, and the combination worked like a charm. It was just a perfect.
So what went wrong?
Well, Julian, you want to get into that?
Dean Martin liked a structure. Jerry Lewis liked a lot of ad-libbing. Jerry Lewis also, there was a lot of tension between them because I think he's about 10 years younger than Dean Martin. Dean Martin, even in those days, wanted to play golf, and Jerry Lewis wanted to concentrate on the act. And so there was real tension. And what Dean Martin resented was being a straight man, because as Arthur and I pointed out, he was a very funny guy himself. But in these things, he would sing, get interrupted. He would just be the straight man. In fact, he said the only good thing about doing those movies was if the lines would be something like, I have to go down to the drugstore, he would say, Jerry Lewis. And Dean Martin would say, oh, you got to go to the drugstore. He said, I didn't even have to memorize lines. All I had to do was listen and just feed him. So it was a lot of tension. And he hated the movies he was making. It's funny to think of him with aspirations, but he really did. If you look at his first movies after 10,000 Bedrooms, and by the way, let's talk about the fact Arthur and I certainly were old enough to remember that the breakup, everybody said, Dean Martin's through. He's nothing. It's all Jerry Lewis is going to be the biggest star that ever was. And as it turned out, Jerry Lewis did okay for a while, but he never came close to Dean Martin's popularity and his importance in the business. Anyhow, Dean Martin at that point makes 10,000 Bedrooms, and it proves everyone's right. It's a big flop. He's through. And then he starts taking really good roles in movies. And his first three movies after 10,000 Bedrooms are The Young Lions, Irwin Shaw's classic with Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift. Some came running that Sinatra gets him the job, supposedly. Shirley MacLaine, directed by Vincent Minnelli. And by the way, Young Lions is Eddie Dimitrich. So, I mean, you've got real good people. And the Rio Bravo with John Wayne and Howard Hawks directing. So all three dramatic roles.
The Young Lions was interesting. It was as you mentioned, based on actually Irwin Shaw's first novel, and Irwin Shaw was a World War II veteran. A lot of the things that happened in the story, particularly the anti-Semitism and the Southern barrack life, all based on what happened to Irwin Shaw, getting beat up for being a Jew. When I went to Switzerland in 1974 to interview Irwin Shaw, the first thing he said to me as I sat down at this little cafe in the little town of Clusters, says, "Who broke your nose?" And I have a feeling he said that because I had a broken nose because I fell on a railroad track when I was 10. But I had a feeling he was wondering whether I was in the Army, whether I got beaten up in an Army barrack like he did. But Dean Martin was not the first choice to play Michael Whitaker, the nightclub crooner in the original. The part apparently was Tony Randall's. But what happened was Dean was represented by MCA, which also, I guess, represented
Brando and Clift.
And they insisted in those monopolistic times that if Fox wanted Clift and Brando, they had to take Dean Martin as well. So Tony Randall, who would have been a very odd choice for that role. I love Tony Randall, great on The Odd Couple. He didn't have the screen heft to play Michael Whitaker in a huge epic movie like The Young Lion. So it was a good choice, and Dean is terrific in the role. He's playing a character close to himself because Michael Whitaker is a nightclub performer rehearsing a big Broadway show when the war breaks out, and he gets drafted.
Back to Martin Lewis for a second here. They were together for 10 years exactly. They broke up on the same day that they got together 10 years later. And from everything I can make out, including from people I've spoken to who knew these guys very well, the problem, it seemed, was that Dean Martin, certain as he was growing, was really a guy who loved to play golf and to take it easy, and he loved, as Julian mentioned, structure and things of the sort that were kind of like, normal. But he was a very somewhat easygoing guy. At the same time, Jerry Lewis was a complete control freak. Jerry Lewis was a guy who wanted to be involved with the scripts. He became with the filming, and they became how shall I say, going from sizzle and steak. The sizzle, of course, was Jerry Lewis. The steak was known to be Dean Martin. But they became guys who liked each other like brothers to guys who got to hate each other as well. Their personalities clashed completely, particularly as success grew and grew and grew. And that's when they split, and in 1956, and they went their separate ways. And then Dean Martin went from Martin Lewis to Dean Martin, who got involved, of course, with Sinatra and then the Rat Pack, and and his TV shows, and he became a superstar on his own without question. And Jerry Lewis kept it going for, God knows, another 40 years, one thing or another.
Well, he actually got into directing and not only starring in his films. And I think that people forget that it was Jerry Lewis, of all people, who invented the idea of video assist on the set, so you could see your footage immediately after you shot it, as opposed to waiting for the next day's dailies and realizing that your footage all sucked and you had to redo it.
Became the bane of a lot of directors. They hated the fact that after the shot, they would all run to the video camera to watch it. A lot of them were very resentful, and the strong ones said, "You're not watching it. You're not watching."
Yeah,
it.
No, it's very true.
But it's interesting, the guy in 1964 records "Everybody Loves Somebody." This song is at the same time the Beatles are around, except that this song knocks the Beatles at their height off. And "Everybody Loves Somebody" is the #1 song in the United States and then around the world.
Everybody loves somebody sometime. Everybody falls in love somehow. Something in your kiss just told me my sometime is now. Everybody finds somebody someplace. There's no telling where love may appear.
And there was the 12th. He did an album with 12 songs. They couldn't find a 12th song, and his pianist, a guy named Ken Lane, said, "I wrote this song years ago, and even Sinatra did it. It just never worked, but it's a good song. Let's try it." And of course, that was "Everybody Loves Somebody Something." Perfect song, perfect voice. And he had other hit records. He had some huge hits from some of the movies they made. "That's Amore." When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's amore. What a line. Come on.
When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's amore. When the world seems to shine like you've had too much wine, that's amore. Bells will ring, ting-a-ling-a-ling, ting-a-ling-a-ling, and you'll sing Vita Bella.
Volare and the memories.
Oh, yeah, and Sway. He did so many hit records. He had a great voice.
Ain't that a kick in the head? Wasn't that something?
Yeah, great from Ocean's 11. But there was another singer around in those days who was a big star, who had a similar style, named Perry Como. And Perry Como also had a very easy-going, relaxing thing. Everybody loved Perry Como. Everybody. Couldn't dislike the guy. He was great. Dean Martin had that kind of a voice in a different way, but he was unlike Perry Como. Dean Martin was a drinker. He was a boozer. He was cigarette smoking. He was with broads and women and stuff. And to get on that topic for a second, Dean Martin had a lot of loves. Though he was married, he was a player. And it's a funny scene in the early parts of their success, huge success. They both got involved with women, even though they were both married at the time. And Jerry Lewis got involved with Gloria DeHaven. It's a fact. And Dean Martin got involved with June Allison, Little Miss Sweetheart. And they went to New York together, all four of them, as the biggest stars in the world. And they just walked down Fifth Avenue, and they didn't care about anything. His life was just that unbelievable to them. But Dean Martin had lots of. There's something that I read where Lana Turner, or Ann Sheridan, or Lana Turner wanted to pay off somebody to get a date with Dean Martin. He was, he was a player, and.
So there's a scene in Ocean's 11, the original, and of course Dean is one of the Rat Pack, where Shirley MacLaine, making a cameo, is getting out of a car in the parking lot of this hotel. She's a little drunk, and Dean Martin is going over to make sure that Richard Conte gets into the electrical system so they can rewire it, so they can rob the place. and he kind of takes care of her for a second, and she says, what's your name? I'm Ricky Nelson. Well, not really. I'm really Perry Como. And she says something that I've always had to have a question about. She says, no, you moved. So I assume that Perry Como on stage was not known as a mover. He kind of stayed in one place. Is that kind of true? Because I know nothing about Perry Como.
Oh boy.
Yes, it was true.
Yes.
But he was sensational as well. The thing about Dean Martin, two things that I've always found interesting. One, even though Sinatra had the big song My Way, nobody that I remember in show business really deserved that more than Dean Martin. He did what he wanted to do. He did it his entire life. He did it more than anyone that I've ever read about or knew about. He did it his way, and it was going to be his way, including these 10% right from the beginning that he didn't honor, and he would just do what he was going to do. He made a deal to do this television show right after Everybody Loves Somebody the next year, that wonderful show that he did, and he was not going to come to rehearsal. And he told them going in, I'm not going to do rehearsals. He did what he wanted to do, and it's a rather interesting thing. He was even famous, Arthur and I talked about this, there'd be big parties at his home, and he would get up and just leave, go up to his room, and while the party was going on, watch a football game or a Western. He had had enough, and that was that. So it was rather interesting to see him. And the second thing I was interested in, very few people, male people, that get both men and women really liking them. Paul Newman did, I think Sinatra did, Steve McQueen. There's certainly people who do it. But I think he probably had it more than almost anyone, that everybody liked Dean Martin.
Well, yeah, he was. He had a certain something. He was a superstar. Everybody wanted to look like Dean Martin, and have his. He did drink. There were people who say, well, he didn't really drink. He was drinking apple juice. And then there's other people saying, I don't know. I knew Dean, and Dean liked to drink. But that was part of the personality: the drinking, the boozing, the carousing, the smoking, all these things. And what happened was, the truth be told, he liked nothing more than to sit around and watch an old Western movie. He loved Western movies.
Well, speaking of Westerns, I think showing his dramatic range after he does The Young Lions, he goes over to Howard Hawks and gets involved with Rio Bravo, playing the drunk. And he's a very good drunk, but he has some great dramatic range. It's actually an ensemble movie because John Wayne is there, Walter Brennan's there, Ricky Nelson's there, Angie Dickinson is there. Angie Dickinson, who, by the way, had been in Ocean's 11. But he showed range. And then he did another film based on a James Jones novel, the guy who had written From Here to Eternity, called Some Came Running, where he plays a gambler, friend of Sinatra's. And he's just really, really good. And occasionally, like in Rio Bravo, he would get a chance to sing. And he sings a duet with Ricky Nelson, which was a lot of fun.
He was extremely professional, too.
He sings the song My Rifle, My Pony, and Me. Alone, without Ricky Nelson. And that song is listed in the Western Writers of America top 100 songs. My Rifle, My Pony, and Me.
He sang a couple of songs. He had actually somewhat of a hit record, Steve, that was written by Audie Murphy. Audie wrote a couple of country western songs, and Dean Martin sang them.
That is a great reveal, Arthur, since you and I are involved in a Audie Murphy project, of course.
Let's not, the thing too about Dean Martin with all of these, I don't want to call it myth, because a lot of it was true, of being a drinker, a carouser, what have you. He was very professional. Always showed up on the set on time, always knew the script, always knew his sides. He knew the script of the other people who were in the movies. He was a very professional, and which is contrary to what the perception was of seeing him.
He seemed to build that impression. Everybody has their prop, and Dean had his glass of champagne or his highball.
Absolutely.
It was kind of his thing. When he gets cast in the Mad Helm series of spy spoofs in the later 60s into the 70s, I think he did 4 of them, which, by the way, was very odd casting. If you've read the Donald Hamilton books that those movies are based on, the Mad Helm books, they're very serious, very serious. They're kind of like Ian Fleming in America books. And they become kind of outrageous. They kind of were early Austin Powers. It was kind of that kind of side of spying, with some of the most beautiful women you've ever seen in your life. In fact, Sharon Tate, who is played by Margot Robbie in the Tarantino movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there's a whole sequence where she goes to see herself in her Mad Helm movie with Dean Martin.
Well, women loved Dean Martin for every good reason. He was such a good-looking guy, and he was sexy and all the rest of that. So he was very big on the concerts tour. He would, play before not only nightclubs, but he got into concerts, 2,000 people. Westchester Playhouse, Julian, not far from where you live. They had a big entertainment center there. So he appears there, and somehow the air conditioning was a bit broken. So while he's singing, "Oh, boys, I got to tell you, it's hot in here. Oh, is it hot in here?" And a woman gets up in the audience and screams out, "I got an air conditioner at home. You come home with me, and I'll leave my husband for you." And Dean Martin's response was, "You got a condition? What do you got? You don't want your husband? I don't want you." So he had that. He was great, extemporaneous, ad-libbing.
He had a lot of funny things. He would say things like, they'd say, "Hey, Dom DeLuise is on your show a lot." And he says, "Yeah, he's fatter than he looks." And then they'd say, "Do you have J&B?" He says, "Well, J&B to me is just booze."
Jewish booze. That's what they call it.
The best thing was the fact that he loved to play golf, as we all pointed out. And to me, the best thing was he said, "I hit 2 great balls today. I stepped on a rake."
Oh, boy. While his TV show was a big success, a TV variety show was a big success, when the numbers started dwindling, they found a way into doing a special, which was a roast, a Man of the Week or something like that. And that became big. It became a hit. And those roasts have outlived everything because they're still on YouTube and they get millions and millions of hits. Don Rickles, who was already established at the time, became as big a star as you could possibly get because he was so great at the roasts. And they would roast somebody every week, and they'd sit there in front of an audience of maybe 3,000 at the MGM Hotel in Vegas. And it was a big dais. Every known comedian was on these shows. And to this day, if anybody here wants to see what they were, they would look them up on YouTube and watch how great Dean Martin is. He's just funny, and he's got the drink in the hand, and he bounces off all the comedians. So that's probably the last incarnation of Dean Martin, the entertainer. Yes, Julian?
Yeah, he did it for 10 years. The celebrity roast, Dean Martin's celebrity roasts were on for 10 years. Yeah. And as you said, you got Bob Hope, you got George Burns, Orson Welles, Don Rickles. They're all showing up. This is something that they like doing. It's easy money, and it's a very big success. Go ahead, Steve.
I was just saying, if you'd been driving down Sunset back in the late 1950s going east, you would see a club called Dino's Lodge. Right. Like a restaurant supper club. It's featured in the TV series 77 Sunset Strip. It's kind of where they filmed there with Ed Kooky Burns. But I remember that my first impression of Dean Martin was his caricature on the sign. That's Dean Martin. Apparently, Jerry Lewis was a little jealous because this was after they had broken up. So he opened his own supper club across the street, but it bombed. It didn't have the panache that Dean Martin's Dino's Lodge did. But I remember seeing Dean Martin early on, like I had said, Rio Bravo, The Young Lions. And then what movie has Dean Martin, Gene Kelly, Robert Mitchum, Dick Van Dyke, all in the same movie.
And the movie is
What a Way to Go with Shirley MacLaine.
Shirley MacLaine, yeah.
And he's great. He plays a really obnoxious small town tyrant. And it's
Mitchell was in that too, huh?
Yeah, Shirley MacLaine somehow gets some kind of curse put on her, and every man she marries dies. So they're very funny deaths. It's a comedy. Believe me, it's a comedy. And
Arthur mentioned that he was such a pro and he knew his lines and he showed up. So obviously he couldn't be that much of a drunk. As we know, you can't do both. But the most interesting thing that I read was that he did not go to rehearsals for his show, but a guy named Lee taped 3 cassettes for him of all the rehearsals. And he had it in his home, he had it in his golf cart, and he had it in his car. And so when he came Sunday for the final run through, he knew the lines, he knew the stuff better than people. And they kept saying, he's a genius. He's brilliant. He doesn't show up, but they didn't know that he got these 3 cassettes every week. It's an interesting thing.
Well, but they worked for him, that not rehearsing and stuff like that. It just was, it fit into his persona. And it was extemporaneous. And another thing that they did was they left mistakes into the show. They let them go. It worked within the confines of the show. Somebody came up with a great bit where he'd open up a door every week and some star would come out of the door. You'd never know who it would be. Jumping on the piano. He was a great star.
Running down the steps.
Whatever it's called, the circular thing. But he had a lot of hit records too. He had a hit record called Volare, which was initially Nel Blue de Pinto de Blue. Some years before that, he caught a hit. He didn't have a huge amount of hit records, but what he did do is he sold a lot of albums singing the American Songbook, much the same songs as Sinatra was doing at the time, but he had his own little lilt to it. And a very pleasing voice. Steve, catch up on Perry Como. I know the show is not on him. You might just listen to some of his stuff. He is great.
By the way, when we were talking about crooning earlier, Arthur, would Eddie Fisher be also considered a crooner?
Yes and no. Yeah, Eddie Fisher had a big voice. He came on the heels of a lot of those guys. I wouldn't call him a crooner, but he was derived from it. He just had a very big booming voice. And what happened with Eddie Fisher was that he just caught one hit record after another. He must have had 17 hits in a row. So, and they ranged in different kind of ways, culminated by a thing called Oh My Papa, which was a great song, the biggest hit he ever had. And he confided to me that he hated his father because his father used to beat him up.
Oh,
but oh my Papa. No, I wouldn't say he was a crooner, no.
So, Dean generally is a very lighthearted in his approach, even in his comedies. He would be a good drunk, a happy drunk. Didn't play anger much. But when he comes to 1970 and he gets cast in the big splashy Ross Hunter production of Airport, he's really pissed in that movie. He has a vendetta in for his brother-in-law, played by Burt Lancaster. As you recall, Dean is an airline pilot, Vernon Demarest. I remember the name vividly. And there's Burt Lancaster's Mel Bakersfield, great name for an airport manager. And it turns out that Dean is piloting a plane headed for Rome from Chicago. There's going to be a bomb threat on it that leads to some real crazy dramatics. If you've never seen Airport, the original 1970, you're in for a treat.
It was also a humongous hit movie. We're all in the movie business. And we all know that irrespective of the greatness of the Citizen Kanes and the Casablancas and God knows, there are a bunch of great movies. being in the movie business, you need to look at the box office and see how did it do? What are the numbers? What are the box office numbers? What are the grosses? That's what you live on. That's your business. And the airport came off a huge book, as I recall.
Arthur Haley.
And it was the biggest picture to that point in time that Universal ever had.
Until E.T.
That was a blockbuster film in the confines of the downtown plus subruns afterwards.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was one of the last big splashy Hollywood movies. This is the beginning of the 1970s, where this is the era of Five Easy Pieces and Easy Rider, where movies started to get smaller and more intimate and edgy.
And here it came, an old-fashioned movie, right?
Old-fashioned movie. I wish we would come back to. We were talking about this the other day. If they filmed It's a Mad, 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 Mad World today, it would cost $5 trillion to make.
Oh, yeah. How about how great Helen Hayes was in Airport? She was terrific.
She's great. Ada Quonset. You can see that I've listened to this movie probably 3,000 times. It was in heavy rotation on my audio tape recorder.
Yeah.
One of the things that was interesting was that Dean Martin was huge in England, and he went over there, and his first time in years, the first time was a place called the Apollo Victoria Theater, which
with Jerry,
2,300 seats, and he sold out. And then he went to the London Palladium, 6 shows sold out. He was huge in England, very, very big.
But you're talking
when he and Jerry Lewis went over there initially, they sold out the Palladium, but they had big problems because the McCarthy committee, Roy Cohn, was sent over by Senator McCarthy to look for communists in England, and the audience resented Martin Lewis being Americans, and so at the end of their shows, they used to get heckling from the audience. The McCarthy, Roy Cohn, there we are again, and it infiltrated other countries. He didn't have enough communists in America; he had to find them in England.
Dean was also a victim of some great family tragedies. His son was killed in an Air National Guard fighter plane accident. That was very tragic. I think he also
destroyed his life. And I think he lost 2 other children as well. But I think he had a total. What did he have? 5 or 6 children, Julian?
Oh, he had more than that.
I think he had 8 children.
4 with his first wife, and then 3 with the second, and I think that's Arthur. I think it was 8.
Yeah.
Right.
But what's really sad about the fact, how much he smoked, and he ended up being diagnosed with lung cancer, and they wanted to perform surgery to continue his life, and he refused. He said, "I will not be operated on. I don't want it." And he died on Christmas Day, 1995. So this December will be 30 years. Yeah.
Every singer who ever sung popular songs can imitate Dean Martin, can never imitate Sinatra. No one ever nailed Sinatra. Amazing. And they certainly could do. We all know the comedians, James Cagney and Charles Boyer, but Dean Martin was doable to any singer. I'll give you a shot right now. Everybody loves somebody sometime. Everybody loves somebody. It's a soft kind of thing. You get into that little bit of an accent, and you're doing Dean Martin. My point is that every singer, as part of their act, wherever they were in the world, would do Dean Martin.
But they couldn't do Dean Martin the way Dean Martin did.
No, of course not. But they'd imitate him and just spread the name further and further and further.
Oh yeah, but boy, wow, he could sing. This whole idea of him being relaxed and charming. There are cuts that he does that are a real singing.
Yes,
real singing. And on the web, I found there's the whole show at the Copa is on the web.
I saw that.
I watched it, and every Streets of Boulevard, a great song, they sing together, and they really dance. They do Soft Shoe. They do a whole routine.
Julian, it was part of their act. It was part of the magic of how great they did everything.
They really, really did. They really were terrific
Well,
together.
since Jerry Lewis was hugely popular in France, I wonder how Martin and Lewis did in France.
I have no idea. I don't
Jerry
know.
Lewis's fame in France took place subsequent to Martin and Lewis
Oh, okay.
as a filmmaker.
Well, that's no question about that. As a director, yeah, that's right.
They love things like The Errand Boy and what was the thing? What was the thing he did at the Fontainebleau Hotel? Bellhop, the Bellboy.
Bellboy, the Bellboy,
yeah,
the Bellboy, and then of course the not the absent-minded professor, the Nutty Professor.
And then Eddie Murphy did that too.
Yes, exactly.
This would be sacrilegious, but I did not like the Nutty Professor for reasons that so many people say, oh, it's so great, it's so brilliant. And, I found him to be offensive in that movie, which he was supposed to be as one of them. But I'm just not a fan of it. But it certainly is, I'm in the minority. A lot of people thought that it was one of the great movies of all time. Steve, you Nutty Professor, you a fan?
I don't know the film very well. I did not watch a lot of Jerry Lewis movies, Dean Martin movies. I think I mentioned to you once that, or I mentioned to Julian that the very first movie I ever put on an audio tape recorder was The Caddy. Just the concept of taking a tape recorder and tape recording a movie. This is long before video cassette, way long before Blu-rays and DVDs. I used to tape record the whole movie, and it was a sleep aid for me. I'd put on the recorder, and I'd fall asleep to The Caddy.
You were ahead of your time.
I was a nincompoop.
But wasn't The Caddy a noisy thing to fall asleep to?
Yeah, but I had noisier. I had Airport. Believe me, with that Alfred Newman music blasting, I'd turn off the recorder after a while because, yes, it was a bit disturbing.
Who was the greatest single impression of Jerry Lewis? Guys, do you know? Everybody did him. Who did him better than anybody ever did him? Marty Short, greatest single impression.
Oh, I'd love to hear it sometime. That'd be great.
Actually, Sammy Davis did a very good one, too.
He did, yeah. Watch Marty Short and you'll see what I mean.
Yeah.
And that fling and the heim and then
you think about, we talked about this many times on our show about how comedy has kind of gone away. But you think of Dean Martin on those 9 years on his television show, 40 million people watched every week. Think of that. 40, you put all the networks together, all their shows together, they don't have 40 million. It's so splintered now. It's unbelievable.
Now you have 40 million stations.
That's right. You do.
And the internet.
Amazing.
Well, it's interesting how variety shows, which were such a staple on television for years, have also disappeared.
That's right.
You don't have, Saturday Night Live is about as close as you get to a variety show with music and sketches.
Let me ask you a question. Would it work today? A great variety show? Would it work?
I think so.
I don't know.
I do. Yeah, I do. But I'm certainly not going to fight for it.
If you want to talk about one of the craziest stars that ever happened in this world was Ed Sullivan unto himself. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's the Bears. Here's the Seals.
Right here.
Really?
Isn't it true that Dean?
Really big shoe.
Isn't it true that Dean Martin was on the very first shoe?
Could be.
I think it was Rodgers and Hammerstein and Dean Martin on the first episode.
And Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis.
Yeah, it wasn't called Ed Sullivan show.
Toast of the Town.
It was called Toast of the Town. Exactly.
But it was Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Could a variety show today work if it were, let's say, contemporary? I'd like to think it would. But
it's hard to say. But
the great acts are not here anymore, guys.
Well, here's the question then: who is Dean Martin today? Is there anybody in the universe that?
Well, somebody would say Michael Bublé. I would strongly disagree, but that's what you'd hear.
Michael Bublé.
I would disagree as well. But over the years, they've been talking about. This is the new Sinatra. This is the new.
No.
Well, it's interesting. You guys caught the tail end of the nightclub era. I grew up. There were no. If you wanted to go take your date to a dance, You went to a dance club where you couldn't hear yourself think, let alone hear. And yet in those days, you could bring a date to a nightclub and there would be a big dance floor and there would be a guy live on stage crooning.
And a band.
And it was just a beautiful social atmosphere. We don't have that anymore.
Well, that kind of precedes Julian and me. What you're discussing is Glenn Miller and the big band stuff. And we were at best little kids during that time. We certainly know of the nightclubs. And there was a dance floor where before the show you would dance. But the bigger the star was, that dance floor would shrink because they put tables in there. And Bobby Darin once did a show on a piano because the entire dance floor was filled with tables.
So he had to stand on the piano?
And did it from the piano, yeah.
I bet there were a few nicks in that piano afterwards.
Steve, the Copacabana would put 6 strings in if you were a major star. So, but the layout of the club was such that here was the band, and you couldn't fit the 6 strings in. So not everybody had it. The big stars, had it. So what they would do is they'd take the 6 strings and plant them in some other part of the nightclub entirely. And so when they would sing, like Sammy Davis would sing, "What Kind of Fool Am I?" And with the part where the strings came in, they'd hit a blue light on the strings sitting in the balcony somewhere.
Was that how stereo was invented?
Kind of, I guess, yeah. It's funny though, but it worked.
When those guys did the Colgate Comedy Hour, the stage managers were Arthur Penn, the famous director, Bud Yorkin, who became a famous producer and director, with Norman Lear. Norman Lear wrote their sketches often, and the very good director from television, John Rich, was the stage manager. So those were the 3 stage managers of Colgate Comedy Hour. Turned out to be 3 very important people working with Dean and Jerry.
One of Jerry Lewis's best friends was a guy named Roy Gerber. Now, I got to know Roy. His son, Billy Gerber, was an executive at Warner Brothers at the time I was involved over there. And I had lunch with Roy and got to know him, a good friend. And Roy was very close with Jerry. He had so many great pictures that were taken with him in the day when he was, in the early 50s and stuff. It turns out that Roy Gerber's roommate was Danny Simon. And they were the odd couple that Neil Simon wrote about.
Danny,
but Danny was the clean guy. I forget his name. And Roy was the slob. So when I was having lunch with Roy, and his tie was stained, his shirt was stained, everything. He was that. Which one was he? What was the name of the guy? The 2 guys, the odd couple.
Felix and Oscar and Felix.
And Felix, who was the slob?
Oscar.
That was Roy Gerber. So. But that's the life they led. They were the odd couple, and that's what he wrote about. But they also were close to Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. They were part of all of that stuff that went on in those days.
Michael, you were about to say something?
Yeah, for me, it's interesting because you guys are talking about, Dean Martin during the 60s, 70s, and earlier. But for me, I remember as a kid, my parents watching the Dean Martin roasts a lot, and watching those and all the different celebrities and how they tore into each other and joked with each other, and it was fun because it's so classic of the Hollywood at that time and everything. It was interesting.
It stands up to this day.
Of course.
If you look at those shows on YouTube, they stand up. The comedy, the humor stands up. It still works.
Oh, very much so.
They're all dead, those guys, though, unfortunately,
I know, but it was wonderful to see a lot of these people just past their primes, a lot of them, but they were still friends. They were having so much fun. It's how I discovered Rickles. It's how I discovered, all these different comedians and such for me. And I always thought it was great. And then I also remember seeing Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. in the Cannonball Run movie with Burt Reynolds. And, because I was already a teenager by then. And
A friend of mine named David Gershenson managed Burt Reynolds, and Cannonball Run was a big hit. And so they had Cannonball 2 ready to go, and he was offered the role of what became Jack Nicholson in the Deborah Winger picture Terms of Endearment. And Burt had 4 or 5 guys around him who were his key advisors, and they said, "Burt, you've got to do this
Cannonball 2.
Terms of Endearment."
Oh,
No, he said, "Fuck that! I want to do Cannonball 2. Are you kidding? It's Money in the Bank." and that was one of those mistakes that people make, I guess. Jack Nicholson got it, and boom.
And the movie was Best Picture of the Year. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
One of the things about Dean Martin that I find so extraordinary was even on television, in light clubs, certainly you could connect with an audience, but his ability to connect with an audience on a television screen was really like no other person, I don't think, that was ever on TV. I think it was an incredible ability that you just knew he was a good guy. You want to hang out with him. You wanted to be with him. And
There it is. You just hit
there he
it.
was.
Well, we've come to the end of the show, and we are going to turn over the festivities to our father confessor, Mike Faber.
well, thank you. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that, sir. You've reached the end of this episode of the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you can find us wherever fine podcasts are found, and now you can even find us up on YouTube. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Or if you're listening to us, please give us 5 stars. If you're into social media, please check us out over on Instagram and Facebook. Of course, before we get out of here, let's check with the guys and see what's happening this week on their podcast. Julian, who are you talking to this week?
This week is the beautiful songstress Judy Collins, who will be talking to us about her career, including some great songs like Both Sides Now and Send in the Clowns. And also, she directed an Academy Award nominated documentary called Antonia, and you'll hear about how interesting that particular film was and how it got made.
That is awesome. Steve, what's cooking over on your podcast?
We're deep into James Bond land. I have Graham Rye on the show, who's the editor of 007 magazine in London, and we answer the question, who will be the next James Bond?
Ooh, I'm going to be curious to find out that one. Awesome.
Do we know him, Steve? Do you think we know him now?
They're one of number of choices. The name that came up was a Scottish actor I'd never heard of, named Stuart Martin. You might hear that name again, Stuart Martin.
Nothing to do with Dean.
No, it's not a relative of Dean's.
It's one of Dean's many children. That's it. Yeah.
That's right.
Arthur, what do we got going on this week?
Thank you. One last thing on Dean Martin, guys, is he possessed the thing that all major stars have, likability. Public loved him, and that's part of any equation of any big star. We're going to be talking about women who are women directors, women executives, women producers of movies. There's a lot of them, and they've done some great work. That's our topic. And Catherine Bigelow and Julia Phillips, here we come.
Awesome. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber. We'll see you here next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. And on behalf of Julian, Arthur, and Steve, we will see you next time. Peace, and we are done. And always remember, your Hollywood adventure starts right here.
How lucky can one guy be? I kissed her and she kissed me. Like the fella once said, ain't that a kick in the head? The room was completely black. I hugged her and she hugged back. Like the sailor said, quote, ain't that a hole in the boat? My head keeps spinning.
Spring is in the air, and you know what that means. No, it means monsters. Hey, it's Monster Attack, the podcast dedicated to old monster movies. Join us every Monday for new episodes at 5 p.m. You can find Monster Attack on any venue that offers podcasts. So check it out. Monster Attack, a proud member of the ESO Network.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.